Hello and welcome. You are the strong ones, and I hope you find interesting this conversation that we're going to have. And just something I didn't put in the PowerPoint, but to maybe keep it in the back of our minds, is that the invention of democracy by Solon, so a long time ago in the Greek time, was linked to the forgiveness of all debts. So actually democracy could be invented only when Solon forgave all the debts of the citizens in the city. That means that when we have a high level of indebtedness, it's basically almost very difficult or impossible to have a true democracy, but let's keep this in mind. So this is a book that I co-authored with Bruno Roelands, and actually was originally written and the research done in English. And then, so it was published with Palgrave Macmillan, and it had 2 editions. And then it also came out in Slovenian, in Spanish, and in Chinese. So it has, basically half of the book is about the last global crisis, started in 2006, really 2007, in the United States, and it arrived in Europe in 2008. And then it became global. And then the other half of the book is about 4 cases with cooperatives in different ways, and I will explain very quickly why we did that. And those cases are in-depth analysis. And why did we choose them? So some are like individual co-ops, but some are cooperative groups. And we chose different cases in developed and developing countries that were linked to other crises. So our interest was that we were having information and data about the resilience of cooperatives compared to other organizations and other types of enterprises. And we were surprised by that. So we wanted to understand better how this could be, because we hear so much that they are small and weak and not well known and so on. And here we were seeing that in fact they were stronger, they were doing rather well, and so we wanted to understand better. And also then we looked at cases that had survived previous crises in different ways. So the case in Mexico, I will show you some photos very soon, has been surviving an ecological crisis with dwindling fishing stocks because of overfishing. And then Serralep has survived a series of buyouts of investor-led enterprises, and here it was doing well as a cooperative in the middle of the crisis. So it's like, how could these people be doing well? And then Desjardins is a well-known cooperative banking and financial group, and of course Mondragon you had under, who explained in depth about the group history and how it is structured. Okay, so one of the things that really struck us when we were doing the book, and then even, let's say, we can see examples every day, is that there has been a shift from ownership to control. So basically now, and even in the incoming, I call it X-accounting, because it's called financial information. The IFRS is based more on liabilities than equity. So everything has to do more with control and debt than ownership and what we used to think of capital and equity. And there are many different examples, and actually it's beginning to affect every idea that we used to have about what we call economic functions. So in consumption, the consumers, the producers, investors, and workers. So for example, consumers, now we think of the access economy. So an economy of services by which we rent things, or we are users, but we are not anymore owners. which is fine. I mean, if we think of recycling, we think of a more sustainable economy, that's the good side of it. But then on the other side, when you have a crisis, you cannot dispose of that. So it's not your capital. You cannot sell it. For example, you can rent if you have an income. You can, for example, rent bikes, rent cars. But then if you're not in a cooperative that owns that, you don't even have a part. And if you don't have an income and there is a crisis, well, you won't be able to pay for that, and you don't have a car to sell. That's an example, but can also be the use we, for example, we have of the internet. There have been cases in which maybe now we are more aware of that, but many people, let's say, we upload photos, even of our families, and then they are used for profit by companies. And then when we claim them back, they say, well, they are not yours anymore because you use our website, but now it's under our control. So it's like, you know, all these things are changing. Then producers, for example, in the supply chains, that have made even difficult to have industrial policy by nation states. For example, already in the 90s, when I was doing my PhD, they were telling me, well, we can't have public policy anymore, industrial policy. Maybe Mondragon can have, but let's say a nation state is very difficult because a company now just makes what the leading mother house or in the supply chain is ordering us to do. So from the quality, the type of product, the timing, the price, the quantity, and the suppliers we use, and logistics, etc. So in fact, the producers are less and less free, and they need to adapt to the leading, let's say, enterprises in the chain. The investors, in the crisis we saw that the small investors, there was a huge difference between the small investors that lost everything and they didn't know even what they had signed on paper or on their websites, and then those who really have access, direct access to updated information on time. And how many, what we call counterparties or over-the-counter practices, which actually are not really market exchanges, are one-to-one phases, like by big, let's say, investors with Goldman Sachs. That's the way they did with Greece. And then, you know, there is a big crisis, but I can explain to you maybe another time. So actually there is a big gap between what we think of capitalist investors, small ones, maybe even related to in our families, and the capacity, the power that big investors and like private equity and so on are gaining over what we used to think of capitalists who are small. And then the workers, we have seen, I mean, the conditions of the workers, that with time now we call it projectariat, precariat, and so on and so forth, like going back to the 19th century or even earlier. They are paid by piece, like it used to be before for these practices. So if let's say the person who buys these pieces or these services is willing to pay and is happy with the product, it pays you. And like 0-hour contracts, and you know, sometimes you can work or offer the product and not even be paid for that or rejected, and there is nothing you can do about it. Even if there is a contract, like in the 0 hours, they can call you or not call you, and it's very difficult especially for youth, but for anyone in this type of conditions, to have a long-term horizon of your life. Let's say, not even a pension, but let's say, how can you get married, have children? Imagine, let's say, how can you build your life? So this is a slide to show you more or less the structure of the book. So we were trying to understand what the crisis was about, and the idea that now we have cyclical crises that are shortened in time. So actually, like, it's showing us that actually all actors, key actors in the economy, are indebted. Before, we used to have crises according to one of the actors. It was the private sector that was highly indebted, or the state, or the households with, let's say, like a housing bubble. And now we had everybody highly indebted. That was a key thing. And then what we call the consumption trap, because we are taught, educated as a very, let's say, in a deregulated context with very individualistic values. And therefore, even in terms of pensions, we should think about ourselves individually and build our own pensions. There is no more solidarity, or it's always weakened. And therefore, let's say, one of the, let's say, the key solutions to this is build capital in your house. That's the way we think now, right? Because then you can sell your house to pay when you're older, and you need to have access to, for example, medical services, or let's say other types of services at the end of life. But this also makes a society in which each one of us looks only after yourself. And then even the pool of funds of these pensions that we think is like, okay, maybe this is the right solution, and you know, we accept it, and why not? But let's say, starting already in the United States, these funds for pensions have always been too small. So most of them are unsustainable. And this we can see mainly, let's say, we have scandals once in a while, especially like in developing countries, from Chile to other countries. But even in the United States, all these funds, sometimes built on the basis of one enterprise, even like could be a big enterprise, like General Motors or others. But let's say these funds are not sustainable. So because they are unsustainable in themselves, then what do? They invest in companies to extract profit in order to be sustainable, because only with the system from the workers, let's say, that's not, it will not work, let's say, in the future. So then there was a process by which we could see the emergence of what we call active investors. Before, we had it from the banks or from others, what we were passive investors. Let's say people that were criticized, let's say, as capitalists, but would put funds in enterprises for the long term. And now we have active investors who just want to restructure and sell the companies at the highest, let's say, possible price, but seeking rent at distance. So they are not really interested in most of the enterprises as such, but they are looking to be there from 1 to 5 years and then come out. And one of the worst things that are happening is that they are not really putting even equity in the enterprise. So what they do is that they buy enterprise with the enterprise itself. So they get a loan and they give the enterprise as collateral. So the enterprise that we think is invested by capital is not. So the enterprise is doubly indebted in the sense that they have to pay the money by which it was bought, and they also have to give the profit to the new active investors. And then, of course, after 5 years, they are done. So one of the ways is to continuously restructure these enterprises and also shed labor all the time. So let's say this was one of the practices that we, let's say there are many studies now about this, but also makes unsustainable the real economy. So when we think what's happening. So let's say all this put together makes it very difficult for the, let's say, the consumers and for the real economy to work in a healthy manner. And therefore, at some point, there are bubbles coming up, like in the last one was a housing bubble, but actually fed by securities in the financial system, by which it was like bets on the mortgages, and then they were resold in tranches and mixed. So actually, nobody knew what these securities came from, to whom they belonged, and even still today, they don't know. So we forgot about them, but that's what we call them toxic. And they were given a AAA. So even in Mondragon, they bought them in Europe, for example, very happily because they trusted the agencies that were rating them AAA, and they were rubbish, okay? So then when there was a change in the IFRS precisely, by which they requested to put these securities on the balance sheet, because most of these things are not on the balance sheet, so we're not even aware, and especially, for example, even the small investors. So nobody is aware of that. But when you have a change in the ex-accounting standards, from one day to the other they decide that they should be in the balance sheet, then it's a big crisis. And then, you know, at some point they panic and they stop, especially in the financial system, lending to each other. And at that point, since they really borrow short and they lend longer, they have a gap, and you know, they used to borrow overnight, for example, Lehman Brothers. So it's such a short time that when there is a gap, let's say the continuous financing, like how do you say, Russian roulette, stops, then the whole thing collapses. So that's what happened the last time. And that was 2006. And then they started to fall one by one, very quietly, because nobody wanted to say too much about this in the United States, until at some point, they touched a bigger bank. And then there was the panic, and then it spread globally. So at that time, then there is a liquidity trap, because nobody wants to lend to anyone else, and then the money stops circulating within the economy, and it reaches the real economy. And then the enterprises begin to close, and nobody can pay anyone else, and so on. And then that's where we cry for the states to come in and especially save the enterprises or the banks. And the people, of course, but the people don't get a lot to be saved. But then, let's say, there is a crisis for political action. So first we think the market should care for itself, but the market can't, and then we call the states. And then the states become indebted. So again, we have to pay for that. And so it's a kind of a vicious circle. But they do that because we fear deflation most and foremost. So we have, let's say, a risk of implosion that happens from time to time, but they reach the real economy, and that becomes a social, political, and fiscal crisis in nation states. So the thing is that now we have so many linkages between trade and finance with the real economy. SMEs, enterprises, and states. So everything is interlinked, and with the globalized, liberalized financial flows, capital flows, that implosion arrives very, very fast. So actually it took maybe 1 to 2 months, and then by January 2009, it was like a collapse of the global economy, especially like trade and investment. And there, many people panicked. So why this time was different? We used to have, and we have had many other crises before, also very hard ones, like the one in 1929. But at the very end of the 1990s, for the first time, all computers in the stock markets around the world were connected. So now the implosion goes global maybe in less than 1 day. So actually it starts to work and reinforce itself as a loop. While before we had the Asian crisis, Russian crisis, Argentinian crisis, or Mexican peso crisis, I don't know if you remember 1994. So every crisis is very hard. But it affected really like one region, one market, one country, and so on. But now it really goes global very, very fast because everything is linked up. The other thing is that all major actors are indebted, while before it was just one key sector of the economy. And then the other thing is because of the Toyotist system in the real economy, which on the one hand is very good, but if things work well. So firms have global scales, but they have little equity. They have just-in-time management, so they don't have stocks. And so if there is a crisis and the thing stops, you know, they don't have maybe enough equity, they don't have enough financing, they are not independent enough, they don't have stocks, and it's very difficult for them, so they really have to shed labor immediately. They can't survive for long. And then they are lending not only to each other, but they are betting against, so for example, banks and financial institutions, like Goldman Sachs and others, so it's like they lend you, but they also bet against your own default. So they will win in both cases, but you will lose. So, yeah. So again, why is that so important? Well, the thing is that control is more important than ownership. And then technological change makes it very difficult, unless you have access to the key technologies and the information that comes with it, to understand the volatility and uncertainty that is really increasing at a very high speed in financial markets, in stock markets, but also for everybody. So even those working in those areas, they don't understand the impact that they can have, and they cannot follow up all the way, even their own products. So the consciousness they can have about what's going on is very, very difficult. One example, the ETF, the electronic traded funds. So how do they work? Some people, like very big financial institutions, they have their own places very near the stock markets with huge machines. They are connected directly, and they are the only ones who have that for their own clients, and the information is only for them, right? So that's one thing. The second thing is that they work in nanoseconds, so we cannot even see it. The SEC, so the regulatory agency in the United States, cannot even evaluate it. It's hard for them to monitor. They have tried to deal with it, and they are not really managing, because it works in nanoseconds. And what do? Is they serve, because these are electronic things. So they are fed with news, one thing. So for example, if there is a declaration by Trump or by a president or by a crisis or by like a financial report, that can feed them. But also, for example, if there is a trend of investors or something, that there is a sale or a purchasing value at some, let's say at 9 o'clock in the morning, they enter like in a nanoseconds and they surf on it, and then they come out. And you don't even see it. So actually, this increases the volatility of the pricing and the uncertainty of what's going to happen. And we are not even aware of that. We suffer the consequences, or we may suffer or not, but not even the states, the agencies can follow that. So this is an example that increases volatility. And of course, we have what we call predatory practices, and which are not bubble-free. And this is why, let's say, we started to see why equality was important, in the sense that, let's say, when I was talking about like this idea of consumption trap, is that because we have a more and more precarious type of labor, and pensions are also uncertain. The pension funds are small. They depend on extracting profit, very quick profits from enterprises. We suffer from cyclical crises, let's say every 5 to 10 years, and so on. The question is that when you start having a growth in the market, like in the housing market, not so many people have enough money to buy housing with their own equity, or with a healthy, let's say, credit, and being able to repay it on time and so on. So what happens is that after a certain, let's say, threshold, they start selling to anyone, because then this need, this push for growth is there, right? And therefore, and to have more profit, and therefore, in the end, they will sell to anyone. And at that time is when we begin to build a new bubble. And of course, the needs of the people are there, the political pressures that build up from there. So the politicians try not to look at that, because it's good to win elections. And therefore, you know, we have a new bubble building up. Maybe next time will be from another side of the, you know, could be of any new practice, any new invention of a new financial product. Last time was CDOs, collateralized debt obligations. But the next time, we don't know what they will come up with. But let's say the market in itself is not sustainable, because we are making people more vulnerable and more precarious all the time. So of course, if we want to grow and sell to more and more people, and only a limited pool is, let's say, has enough funds on their own jobs, they have, let's say, a decent pay, and so on, then it's, of course, we can only have more bubbles in the future. So the key issue is how can we promote stakeholders in generating wealth in a market economy in the end, but separating it from what we still call a capitalist system, which we began to have a doubt, and we said maybe we should call it debtism or something like that instead of capitalism. Well, if you read, for example, you know the book of David Graeber, on debt, that gives so many examples of practices in 5,000 years about debt. But also if you read Aglietta's, you know, Michael or Michel Aglietta, he's, let's say, one of the fathers of the regulation school in economics. And he has a book from 1997, maybe between 1996 and 98. And it's very interesting because the book talks about regulation, right, in the new context, in the new system that we were having since the 1980s and 1990s. And there you find everything. And then at 2 points, but very small, he says, well, the basis of our system is debt. And then in the post phase of this book, he explains what was happening later in the years 2000 and 2010, and even perhaps with the crisis and so on. And he's proposing, well, since there will be no jobs and no income purchasing power and so on and so forth, we should give a minimum income to everybody. So he was writing it in 1997. Now, the issue is that why? Because debt makes it unsustainable, our system. The system we're building now is unsustainable. And one other thing he was saying at that time was that there is a big difference between what we, let's say, a market economy and the financialized economy, because the debts are, let's say, in a market economy, the debts are, how do you say, eased out. So since prehistory, so let's say you give something or you take something from someone, and then, you know, that other person has something to repay you or to give you back or to in recognition, let's say, to have peace, to work, to live together, and so on. So then this gradually developed, let's say, in a more modern world. But when you have a financial economy that is autonomous, the debt created has no link to the real economy. So it's something that is impossible to repay in a way. So he was explaining, in other words, how unsustainable the new system was being created. And therefore he was proposing, he was saying, well, on the basis of our, how do you say, being a member of our society, we should be able to have a minimum income. etc. The problem is that if we have that as a basis of survival, well, we know what happens is that who will be part of society and who will not. We will have always people standing up, I am part of this group, you are not part of it. So get out, you know, and this could be black people, could be indigenous people, could be women, could be poor people, could be immigrants, could be anyone. So it looks a nice solution, but if it's only based on being thought of part of just a territory, then who is part of that? So the debt we saw, why debt was used, and there are many publications about this, and the publications are not from the left, come from the financial sphere, Davos discussions, I mean, economist publications, and you can find them in the book as well. So they explain that debt is used as a tool to discipline, not only labor, but also enterprises and management. So they thought that since the 1950s, managers were having too much power, so one way to discipline them, especially middle management, to get rid even to middle management, was to use debt. Another thing was to avoid taxation, which means that they were really getting out of any social contract, and also did not like mediation mechanisms. And this means, for example, trade unions and so on. And then also was necessary to control, to develop global chains, but the Toyotist type of control, which means that you don't need to own the company, but you control the type of production, as I said before, what they produce and in the chain. But then we end up that it really reinforces austerity policies, which again makes at least parts of the population more vulnerable through structural reforms and so on. And then that feeds up again into, if we want to have a growth in the market with the consumers, at some point we will have a new bubble because they cannot pay for that. So what cooperatives did in the crisis? Well, first of all, we consider cooperatives different in three key things. So the purpose of cooperatives, the type of control, and the allocation of surplus. We prefer to talk about surplus or profit. Before, we always talked about surplus, even in the US. But now, of course, with the type of language we get accustomed to, we say profit. And one example, I think, was clear, was Mondragon, right? But also Bruno explained in the definition that we have the two things. So it's ownership and control go together. And that means that cooperative members have a double nature, that are stakeholders and owners, controllers. And that makes a big difference compared to other types of enterprises. So we can say that there were, let's say, different type of management strategies in the short term and in the long term. In the short term, what's interesting is that the cooperatives put information more quickly updated in common. So they knew there was a crisis. They knew there was a problem coming up. And as soon as they know, they start thinking, okay, how are we going to survive? What are we going to do? How is it going to affect us? Or if it's starting to affect us, how can we respond to that? And therefore, they think in common. So that's one thing. While in other organizations or enterprises, people are not aware until it's the end of it and says, okay, we have to sack you because we cannot survive, or you know, it's the end of the enterprise, or we have to delocalize, or we have to close for some time, and so on. Also, they have a more equal pay scale. So when the hard times come, they are more willing not to necessarily exploit themselves, but to make a sacrifice, to work together, to share cost, to share, let's say, work, to be more flexible, to find different types of solutions. They are also tend to be less indebted, because for them it's hard to be indebted. So to have, let's say, easy funding from the, let's say, stock markets. So on the one hand, when things go well and you see that the stock markets are doing very well, many cooperative members say, oh, that's really bad, we cannot be there, we don't have this easy money and, you know, investors that give us money. But when the hard times come by, they are not so indebted. So that's when they really feel stronger compared to others. And then when they have good reserve funds, they can manage to have better guarantees still compared to others, and also to be more resilient. It doesn't mean that it's easy for them, that they don't suffer, that they don't make sacrifices, that they don't collapse. It happens, it can happen, but everything shows they're more resilient compared to others. And also they tend to build, before or after, more safety funds, more support institutions, to put more things in common, and therefore, especially in the short term, they are really stronger. But then another thing they tend to do is, in the longer term, they put more resources in commons, not less. The cooperative values are reinforced. When things go well, maybe they tend to have doubts. Or maybe we should have more, you know, quick or higher surplus or profits, or more income, etc. But then when in times of crisis, say, no, we can survive better together, and therefore we should really reinforce our identity, our values, and do new things. And that's an interesting thing, because they don't just try to survive, but they try to think of the future again in the long term. So it says, this crisis is showing us that things are not going well. This crisis is showing us that the system is not working. So why? And then what can we do? So maybe what we were doing before, it was not good enough. Maybe in that sector or that type of work or the way we were doing things, we can even improve further. So they use it to do new things. And this is because the rationale mainly is for the long term. They are rooted in the territory. The members come from the communities. They have a common interest, especially when they have common funds like indivisible reserves or good reserve funds and so on. This provides an anchoring. And when I said anchoring, is anchoring to the fears you can have in front of a crisis. Anchoring in terms of expectations to survive. So this means that instead of just becoming afraid and saying, oh my goodness, I'm alone, what am I going to do? It says, no, we are together and we have time to breathe, and then, oops, you know, then let's see how we can do, how can we go from here? So these are some pictures. So this is in Mexico. If you have read the book, you know the story. So for the first, let's say, I don't know, 30, 40 years, the state never helped them. So at some point they discovered already in the 70s that, and 80s, and that the fishing stocks were almost finished. So they said, oh my goodness, you know, they are an island. So they said, okay, let's close some areas and see what happens. So let's close them for 4 years. And after 2 years, they saw that they multiplied. So, wow, you know, like the Bible, they multiply the fish. So then they said, wow, you know, so maybe now we can close some other areas and fish here. And they started to have, and also have a scientist with them, a member in the cooperative, and they began to have a lot of fish. So that's very interesting, because then they industrialized. So when we think of, you know, ecological crisis, usually we think we should, you know, have less fishing, less production, less, you know, we should shrink the way we produce. And in the beginning, and then afterwards they continued with that, it was a good idea, but that allowed them to industrialize. So for me, it was like, you know, this is, you know, of course they did it in a sustainable manner, but then they had their own brand, and they started to have also ecotourism with like reef checks and NGOs. Then because they were having success, they began to have pirates. So they bought like a boat to go after the pirates. And then they had some people shooting at them and all kinds of things. But yeah, it's true. And then because of that, some US universities, even Stanford, they began to become interested. Oh, look at these people, these peasants who are, having success with the fishing stocks. They are sustainable. They share everything. How is this happening? So they began to support them and to work together. And now they have also a kelp forest, so under the water, not only on the island. They have, of course, they export. So during the crisis, they survived quite well. Now, if you go and see the news on the websites, you can see that they are doing still well. Now they are also cooperating with Mexican universities to save birds. And the other thing was interesting is that the people retire early because this is a very heavy kind of job. Everything is very monitored, let's say how much fishing, how much they dive, how many hours, and so on. But when they retire, they receive money to open a shop in the mainland because they are more or less young. But that's good, they are not left on their own. So they can still have a life after that. They can stay on the island, they can open a shop, they can do whatever they like. They also have, they didn't have like electricity in the island, so they have brought now the cables, but they put them inside the, how do you say, under the earth, so not to affect the birds. So they have all this thinking behind it. So these are just some pictures. Okay, so this is about Serralep. Serralep was the last, this is a very high value added type of product. Porcelain insulators is a very industrial, let's say, company. It was the last one of its type in France. And there were different buyouts, and every investor that came to save them, in the end they were just taking out machinery, sending it to other countries, putting some funds in Switzerland, and so on and so forth. Until at the very end, they became conscious through a manager that they were really going to close down the entire thing, and then the workers that were left, they rebelled, and they occupied the factory, and they didn't have support from the state or anything, but they had support from the cooperative movement and the community, the local community, that even they put money in coins in the local highways or everything to support and to give them food and during the occupation. This was in France, not Argentina or... And they were doing well in the crisis, because once they made it a cooperative, they had the knowledge, but they had to learn all the other aspects that, in these current systems, the workers don't have access to. This means the clients, marketing, sales, and so on. So for that, they had support, for example, from a Coca-Cola manager, because some people committed suicide, and he was a friend of one of them, and he was so shocked that he was part of like an advisory role. So there were people who really helped them from cooperative movement, even a Coca-Cola manager and so on, and now they are doing well, and you can go to Bloomberg and see their information, but Bloomberg will not tell you that they are a cooperative. Okay. So I will show you later, but the thing is that the survival of these are the scopes, are the production and worker cooperatives, for example, in France, but there are other types of statistics that show that the cooperatives have a higher rate of survival compared to other types of enterprises. So it's not only in times of crisis, but in common times are also have a higher rate of higher in terms of life, enterprise life. So in the case of the Desjardins, well, this is a very well-known group that has gone through a series of restructuring, growth. So I just wanted to tell you a couple of things. So this is a photo. We visited the museum. It was the house where they invented the credit unions in North America, because the US actually learned from them to take them into the US. And that big book was the book where the people would put the money, a little bit of money, and then afterwards they could get like a micro loan now. And that was managed by the wife. So the manager of the first credit union was Dorimen, and she was paid, I think, $50 per year, something like that at that time. So that was managed by a woman. And one of the things that they are in the museum is this, they have different pictures and so on, but that is in French. And one of the things, let me see, the second line, it says that why did they created it. So Alphonse Desjardins actually went to Europe to learn, especially from the Germans, and then went back to Canada and they opened it in their own house, the very first one. But what they said is that savings and credit was not accessible to the workers, to the people, to the common people. But also, and that's very important, usury in the loans, like loan sharks, what we say today, were really creating misery. So people could never come out of their debt, and it was shark loans. And that's why they created Desjardins. And then in 2010, so more or less the middle of the crisis, they received a prize about the best bank of the year in Canada. Well, these are some pictures, but you know from under, just other pictures. So that's of the General Congress. I suppose that's where under works, more or less. Yeah. And the university, and also one of the very first cooperatives actually of students. And that's very important because they didn't have money to pay for their studies. So what they did is that they work half day and the other half day they can study. So, and that still exists. So that's a good example of youth, cooperative for youth. So I won't go into that because I think it has been explained. So actually what is very important for cooperative is that at the micro level there is a huge mobilization in terms of knowledge, information, resources, and different types of capital. But at the meso level, they create and they use mutual help institutions. We can call them in different ways, but that's extremely important. Solidarity institutions, support institutions, whatever you want to call it, and of course, if they have a good legal framework. So that the trust, the social capital they generate is very important, not only for growth, but also in terms of resilience. And that's possible because they generate a higher degree of equality, and the general wealth is better distributed, not only within the cooperative, but also, let's say, across the community. Therefore, there is a higher degree of legitimacy, and the information is more transparent. So they are able to look forward in the long term. And therefore, in terms of fundings, they have more common funds, reserves, indivisible reserves, investment funds, solidarity funds, and that helps them to anchor the expectations and the fears, but also have more adaptability, more flexibility. And therefore, they can reinforce themselves, but also reduce the weaknesses. So one, I think, an important thing is that equality and freedom, and that means democracy, is very much linked to the reduction of indebtedness and the use of debt and usury and what we call debt bondage, that right now is very much used in labor. We were talking the other night, I think. For example, there is migration, and I'm not talking, for example, to give an example from war, like Syria, from Africa, but we know about cases from China. So, and there are publications and news about this, including in Spain, and before the crisis and after that. So this is a system that is very much used, as we said in the book, in the 17th century, 18th century for the US, that a big part of migration is used through debt bondage. And right now is used again, as before. So, for example, they would send the Chinese people who are debt bonded in the sense that they have to pay for the trip and the installation, for example, let's say in Spain. So they will be placed without any documents in a Chinese restaurant or business. They will have a place to sleep and some things to eat, let's say rice or some food. And they cannot see anyone, they cannot complain about anything, they have no rights. But once they have finished paying for their trip, they are free. This is why it's debt bonded and not slavery, specifically. And once they are debt-free, they get their documents back, and sometimes, in the case of the Chinese, they get some money to install themselves as a new restaurant or a new shop, and they will get newcomers coming from China as debt-bonded until they repay with labor, and then they get free, and so on. So once you do that, it's very difficult, I was saying, for local companies to compete with that, because labor is free in a way. So for them, maybe it's okay, but for local, let's say, enterprises and for workers, it's really, it's very difficult to stop that, but also to deal with that and also to survive against that. So until we become aware of that, it's very difficult also to talk with the public authorities because they look aside for different reasons. Okay. So in the end, one of the key things that we were seeing is that we need to rethink and rebuild what we call cross-control. We don't believe anymore that control top-down works. No. But bottom-up is not enough anymore. So we need to rethink like not only vertical, so top-down, bottom-up, but also horizontal. So information has to flow across the entire organization. So participative democracy has to be able to, let's say, be active across, let's say, the entire organization. So for the future, we need to rethink and rebuild what kind of cross controls and balances, like a future democratic system, we can have within every place, every institution, not an enterprise, but everywhere. And of course, we should keep that alive and improve in cooperatives. So in this way, we were discussing, let's say, how this view about the global crisis was having an impact or not on micro, let's say, practices at the level of an enterprise. In this case, of course, it was cooperatives or a group of people. And one thing that we wanted to, it's not in the book, but here you can say these are the first principles of what we call the Rochdale pioneers. And one of the key things, as Bruno has said already, is that they were also very much aware of this issue of debt. And two of the things are linked to that. So pay limited interest on capital, but also cash trading, no credit, because they were so much against usury and this issue of debt that you know, they needed to think about that and to work it out, to work it through, so that let's say they had a healthy growth and that everybody could share and generate let's say common wealth that was able to be shared with others. So the other thing is that what we like usually to say is that we need, like before, to distinguish markets from capitalism. So first of all, we have had markets forever. So from prehistory to any kind of system, to any kind of ideology. So markets we will always have. The question is which type of market? Capitalism did not exist even in the time of Marx. Marx did not write about capitalism, he wrote about capital. So that's very important to remember that capitalism is a word created in 1904 by Sombart, and we don't even know that we are still in capitalism. So we can call it in different ways, we can discuss it, it's very good, but we should keep this in mind. So we are free to maybe call it something else or maybe create something different. And the other thing is that we see that the current system is not really generating capital, is not respecting social capital, natural capital, even financial capital. It's really destroying like a bonfire of capital every few years. And this is not sustainable if we want to live in peace all together. So, you know, we need to analyze what is the value of the things we do, how we value them, and not only ourselves, our work, but our community, our resources, our assets, and also those who live with us, including animals, including nature, and so on. So. Then from Ostrom, you know Elinor Ostrom, who received a prize, a Nobel Prize in economics, about the commons. Again, she was calling in 1990 that we still need a collective action theory to prove that we can do it. Maybe it's not necessary anymore, but she wrote that in a way we are always trying to justify ourselves, to justify in front of economists. So these are just some things about, these are examples that, let's say, in green is cooperative banks, in blue is the entire cooperative sector, that by 2014, let's say, between the height of the crisis and then afterwards, cooperative banks were building better quality capital compared to other banks. They were closing, I'm not sure this is the case anymore, because now I know that in Germany, in Holland, they are closing more branches. But at that time, they were clearly not closing as many branches as the entire banking sector. Again, the resilience of enterprises, in yellow, the worker co-ops compared to other types of enterprises. We can see that they survived better, and they, let's say, there was a loss in numbers of enterprises that was clearly lower than other types of enterprises. And this was in the case of Spain, between 2006 and 2011. Okay, so this is to finish. It's not in the book, but we'll try to go as quickly as possible. So the thing is that, first of all, especially the last crisis is making us rethink what a crisis is. So we have different types of crises coming together. So ecological crisis, climate change, social crisis, financial crisis, migration crisis, okay, you name it. And therefore, we are thinking more as a cyclical phases of a crisis. And that is not enough anymore to survive, but we should better prepare for the next one. So now, in terms of crisis, there are different phases. So like first to surviving, coping with the shock, recover from that, creating sustainability, and be prepared or mitigate the next crisis or the next phase of the crisis. Yeah, it's not maybe very joyful, but that's the way we are thinking now, even at the level of the United Nations. Okay. So the key thing also, there is a change in thought from agency, from individual agency to collective agency. So now it's very clear that alone we cannot do very well. We may survive a bit longer, but not much longer. So we better do it together. So this idea of regaining collective action, like becoming an actor in front of a crisis, and also in general to be more resilient, is becoming more and more pronounced. And therefore the idea about resilience and sustainability is also more like cyclical and preparing for another crisis, and also in the way that is sustainable not only for in our lives but also for the future generations. So this was from a research I did in terms of cooperatives and refugees. And actually across the world, I was doing interviews in a project for the ILO, and I found cooperatives actually in all phases, doing different things, but actually it was very interesting to see that they were active in different phases according to what they were doing, and in different parts of the world, so developed as well as developing countries, and we can find them contributing with in their roles in different ways. So the resilience of cooperatives actually have a wider impact. So it's not only the issue of jobs, that because they are more resilient, they keep more people on the job for a longer period of time or forever, but also they keep alive the economic activity in the community. And that's very important to tell the states and the local authorities, because if you have a real economy functioning, then maybe they will have also a better tax collection, because we know that many enterprises don't pay any tax, especially active investors who delocalize very quickly. They receive subsidies, then they close, and there are many cases about that. But cooperatives and local SMEs, not only cooperatives, but let's say local community enterprises, they are rooted. So they are very important, and especially in times of crisis. So there is a real investment in the local economy. There is also lending to SMEs, more than other types of banks. And therefore the benefits are for the wider system as such. And these are examples that are not in the book, but are providing responses in this century, because what we are seeing is that new types of cooperatives coming up. And I just wanted to show you, this is to finish, because it's very important that you keep in mind that you can invent new types of cooperatives. So don't be afraid, not only to study, to copy, to learn from others, to share, but also to invent new cooperatives as you see fit, as you need it. So, for example, we have rural electric cooperatives, which are extremely important in the US, in Argentina. They provide about electricity to 75% of the territory in both countries. But now they also, for example, provide community services. They connect the communities across the countries in terms of Wi-Fi, internet, and so on. But they also, let's say, invest locally, and they help the communities to thrive. And that's from Kwapa Coco, which is a well-known case, a successful case from Ghana. And an interesting thing is that now we see the appearance of what I call solidarity value chains. So we know that fair trade, most of the fair trade is done through cooperatives, right? But now what we also see happening is that let's say cooperatives from the south and the north are linking up. So in this case, with the support of ethical banks, they created a joint venture with the consumer cooperatives in England. So the joint venture from both sides is established in the UK. There are also cases in coffee where you have a joint venture in Norway, between Guatemala and the consumer cooperatives in Norway, or in the US and countries in the south, and so on and so forth. So let's say what we see is the emergence of cooperatives that are not only multi-stakeholders maybe, but also from different continents. Then in the schools, well, these are some pictures from Spain, but you can see from could see now Germany is beginning to create this type of cooperatives with children in schools. Sometimes they say that the most difficult part is convincing the principal if they don't know much about cooperatives, because the teachers may be enthusiastic, but maybe the principals say, okay, but I don't understand, so they have to explain and convince them and so on. But actually it's something which is very good. And of course you can see there lots of reasons why it's good. Not only because the pedagogy, the philosophical approaches are really nice and positive and good to learn, but also that they can learn about skills, about work, about community involvement by themselves, self-management skills, about democracy and about solidarity, about ethics, about power, and about divergence in terms of opinions. So as a child, let's say, it's great to learn about that. This is an example about the importance of agricultural cooperatives in the world. These are two maps that were not created by cooperatives, but the fact is that where you see most cooperatives in the world is where you see least hunger, except in the case of India, which is a very complex country, and there are many, many great cooperative groups in terms of, let's say, for example, dairy and other types of produce, but still there are huge problems in terms of poverty and hunger. But otherwise, it's very clear. Where you have a lot of farming and agricultural cooperatives, you have least hunger. And then about housing, I had many other slides, but I took them out because there were already too many. But this is what I said yesterday. For example, that's an example, Goldman Sachs investing $500,000 to buy foreclosed homes, so homes lost to indebted people because of the crisis, to convert them into rentals. So preparing for those who will not be able to buy them, and then why it's good for governments to support cooperatives in housing. And this is one example this is temporary housing, because usually we think, and yesterday I mentioned different models for long-term housing, but another thing is for temporary housing. So people who need temporary housing for different reasons. For example, women suffering violence, also with or without children. Youth with problems, disadvantaged people, maybe, let's say, those who are researchers. And Bruno and I too, we have been there. So this is outside Milan. And it's very interesting because they managed, that's one of the rooms. It's very nice. They have also open spaces. So you have places where you can be working and have a television and kitchens. That's one part of the building. But another part has an incubator for community enterprises, social enterprises, cooperatives, and so on. Another one is a restaurant or a cafe. Another one is a place which is closed. You cannot go into, like, several areas or floors. So one is, for example, for women with violence, so they can stay there with children and be protected. Another one is for youth with problems, for example, maybe coming out of drug addiction. I saw once a boy who was a migrant, like a refugee. And what was interesting is that this is a social cooperative. So actually they work closely with the local authorities. And when they receive these people, they have like a dossier, right? So they discuss with the person, in this case was a young person from Africa, and they have a contract. And in those contracts, they have goals. So the person discusses his own goals or her own goals with the social cooperative, and then they are followed. They are supported, but they are followed by them. And for example, if he's going to study, what he wants to do, or be trained, having a job, and so on and so forth. And also people coming out of drug addictions or other types of problems. So they have like a personal contract in terms of their own goals. And then they are supported by a psychologist, by a doctor, and so on. So they have different parts, and it's quite a nice place. So that's an example, but that's for temporary housing. Okay, so that's... and then in terms of work, so here we know we have talked yesterday, today, so 0-hour contracts, precariat, future employment, welfare exclusion, maybe exclusion from future pensions, because if you cannot contribute because you don't have a stable pay, low training or no training, etc. And then people are creating new types of cooperatives. So in this case, in France, for example, you know, the CAI and the SIC, have you heard of them? Okay. So one is called Cooperative of Activity and Employment, and the SIC is like a cooperative, a community cooperative for collective interest, or a common interest. So the interesting thing is that if you want to study them or you want to understand cooperatives, don't just talk with the people, go to see them, to interview them, get their structure, because once you begin to see their structures and the power structures and how they work, that's when we barely begin to understand what they really are. Like in the case of Mondragon, you know, you have, oh, Mondragon, this one, but when you really start looking at their structures and how they work, it's like, oh my goodness, you know, so much effort they have put into building these, how many years, and you know, then you begin to understand really what they are about. So the thing is that these new types of cooperatives are multi-stakeholder, so at least they should have 3 different types of stakeholders. So for example, the workers, the consumers, local authorities or producers or something else. And then they are in the territory and they link up. So they have different types of projects, and usually they focus on responding to one need. So this can be as simple as keeping the last cafe open in a village, the last gas station or petrol station, a library, a swimming pool, but can be more like an incubator. It could be anything that is important for the local community, and it is multi-stakeholder. And then the CAI, they're a bit more complicated still, because it's like a sum of a collective project and individual projects. So it's between an incubator and a worker cooperative, but it's different because you know, these are members who actually are independent from each other. So for example, you are a film director, another one is a translator, another one is a worker in the construction, and so on. And then they come together into this cooperative, and they share the costs. So the place, the accounting, secretariat, all these things. But they can also work as an incubator for themselves and for future projects. And the other thing is that once they can also, how do you say, stream their income through the cooperative. If they do that, they can also become employees of their own cooperative, like a worker cooperative. But when they do that, then in the case of France, they have a better pension. As an employee, you know, you have a better pension and better welfare than a liberal profession. And these are liberal professional people who actually, through these type of cooperatives, they become employees of themselves in a way, and of the cooperative, and then they have a better access to welfare and pensions. But then the other thing is that this is an example. They are also multi-stakeholders, and they begin to cooperate with many others. So it's like a hub, like a platform. So these type of new cooperatives are more complex. In a way. They are not anymore just producers or workers or consumers. They put different types of work together, and what comes out could be different type of jobs. And so again, that depends on the legal framework, what are the needs of the people, and what you can do with them. So, and then another type that I didn't put here is, for example, food cooperatives, something that they have invented in the US and now it's spreading, for example, to Argentina, to France, to Belgium, to other parts. And these are different from consumer cooperatives because it's based on voluntary labor. So the people who are members, they have a contract by which they work 4 to 8 hours per month. So most of the people are voluntary workers, and they pay only those who manage all that. Yeah? And then they basically have high quality products and they decide what they want to buy. It's a cooperative, so they're autonomous. They decide what they want to eat and to buy and so on. Usually they tend to focus on fair trade, local produce, also maybe long distance fair trade products and so on. But if you go and see, and you can find on YouTube and other channels, now there are documentaries, there are news, you can go and read them, watch them, or interview them. It's very interesting because as so much voluntary labor, the costs are reduced by 60%. And then they buy in bulk. So then they buy teams, they divide, let's say, in the packaging. So they try to reduce also the packaging and also the costs of packaging. And really, they can have a very good quality, let's say, things to buy at a very low cost. And this is a new type of cooperative, but there are others. So what I mean is that don't be afraid to invent your own. It's just that you need to think very carefully and then try out and keep trying out as an experience. And then I'm sure you will have a lot of success. Okay, so thank you.